Welcome, and thank you for joining me. Before we begin tonight's story, I invite you to settle into a quiet, comfortable place. Take a moment to soften your surroundings. Perhaps dim the lights, put on your headphones, and let the weight of the day gently fade. My name is Historian Couch, and I'll be your narrator for this long, calming journey into the past. Before we begin, tell me, at what time are you watching this? Midnight? 2 a.m.? Just after sunrise? Let us know in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where and when these sleepy stories find their listeners. In this video, we'll be stepping quietly and carefully into a world that once existed behind closed paper doors. A world of hushed conversations, slow rituals, fragrant incense, and lives spent in the delicate shadows of power. This is the story of a woman, and many women, of those who lived not as wives, but as concubines, selected, sent, and sometimes forgotten within the wooden walls of palaces and pleasure quarters in ancient Japan. We will explore the daily rhythms, the unspoken hierarchies, the relationships, and the secrets that shaped their lives, not as a tale of scandal, but as a quiet, respectful unfolding of human history. A world of silk, stillness, service, of ritual, of waiting, and of voices almost lost to time. So, close your eyes if you wish, breathe slowly, and imagine yourself drifting into a different century. One where the floor creaks gently beneath a lacquered sandal, where the scent of camellia oil rises faintly in the air, and a woman kneels quietly at her writing desk, preparing for another day inside the invisible world of the court. This is inside the world of a concubine in ancient Japan. Let us begin. Imagine yourself not in the world of now, but in the amber stillness of Heian-era Japan. The year is 998, and dawn rises not with alarm clocks or electric lights, but with the soft rustle of sliding shoji screens and the deep hush of a palace still dreaming. The court wakes slowly, in the residence of a middle-ranking noble, among the soft corridors of lacquered floors and incense-stained eaves. A woman stirs. She is not the empress. She is not even a consort in the direct household of the emperor. She is a concubine, one of many. But for now, she is simply a woman waking in the hush of morning. Her chamber lies at the east side of the estate, where the first morning light enters through finely latticed windows screened with paper as pale as the influence of the moon. The moon guided much of court life. It marked poetry contests, love letters, rituals of purification. She often stood at the edge of her veranda when it rose, watching it catch on the lacquered tiles, softened the hard lines of the palace into silver shadow. Some said it carried messages. Others claimed it drew out emotion. She believed only that it made things quieter. Beneath the moon, her thoughts slowed, and in that stillness, she sometimes understood things the day would not reveal. Reverence in every gesture, even in the simplest acts, pouring tea, arranging flowers, lighting incense, there was reverence. Each gesture was a kind of offering, a quiet alignment with balance, with beauty, with that which could not be explained. The palace was not just a home for politics or desire. It was a sacred space, delicately perched between the world of men and the realm of spirits. To live there was to learn humility, to know that not all power was seen. Not all voices were heard aloud. And in that knowing, she found peace. The hierarchies within, rank, favor, and invisible lines. In the gentle rhythm of palace life, hierarchy was not always shouted. It was whispered, hinted, folded into robes and reflected in seating arrangements. Every concubine knew her place, not by what was spoken aloud, but by what was left unsaid. Rank shaped everything: where one walked, how one ate, and which screen she waited behind. There were no locked doors in the inner palace, only layers of protocol. A concubine of the fourth rank could not cross into the quarters of one above her without formal summons. Even glances had their own subtle hierarchies. Who could meet whose eyes, and for how long? Meals were served in order of status. The higher the rank, the warmer the rice, the fresher the fruit. No one complained. That too was a form of silence. A favored woman might receive silks of brighter color, or be granted a private veranda overlooking the garden. Another might wait months for such recognition, only to be passed by. But rank could shift like the wind. One season of favor could elevate. One mistake could erase years of quiet waiting. Still, within these delicate rules, women found ways to survive. Some did so by remaining invisible. Others learned the art of gentle assertion, stepping forward just enough to be noticed, never enough to appear presumptuous. The true currency of the palace was not beauty or youth. It was timing. The attendants' world, servants, messengers, and silent witnesses. The concubine was never truly alone. Behind her quiet, there were always footsteps, soft, deliberate, belonging to those who waited just beyond the screen. They were the hands that folded her robes, the eyes that watched but never asked, the ears that heard what no one admitted to saying. Each concubine had a small group of attendants, loyal, discreet, and trained in the quiet arts of observation. Some had served since childhood. Others had been brought from noble households to learn courtly discipline. They spoke little and moved even less. An attendant could enter a room without stirring the lamp's flame. She could understand her mistress's mood by the angle of a comb or the absence of perfume. These women held knowledge like water cupped in their hands, careful not to spill, careful not to grasp too tightly. When letters needed to be sent discreetly, they carried them. When tempers flared behind brocade screens, they remained calm, offering cool cloths and warm tea without judgment. They saw the rise and fall of favorites. They remembered every expression on the emperor's face. Yet they left no record. Their loyalty was silent but constant. Sometimes a concubine trusted them more than her peers. Sometimes they were the only ones who knew when she wept. The emperor's glance, power, distance, and fleeting intimacy. He was not always present. In truth, most days passed without a glimpse of his robes. And yet, his absence was felt as clearly as his nearness. The emperor was not just a man. He was a presence, a symbol, a wish that could rise or vanish with the turning of a season. A concubine did not seek the emperor. She waited to be summoned. Sometimes it was a formal invitation, written in elegant script and delivered by a court official. Other times it came in the form of a folded fan or a scented cloth left on her tray. Subtle signals known only to those within the palace's long traditions. An evening with the emperor did not guarantee favor. Many were summoned once, never to be called again. Others, rarely seen in public, became quiet powers within the court. When he did arrive, the air changed. His steps were measured, his words few, and yet everything mattered. The direction of his glance, the weight of his silence, the choice of poem shared over plum wine. For some, he was distant and divine. For others, he was simply a man shaped by ritual, bound by duty. To be close to him was to live in a place both privileged and precarious. And yet, most concubines did not love him. They revered the idea of him, not the person. Celebrations and ceremonies, life inside the calendar. The year passed not in months, but in moments. Ceremonies stitched the seasons together. Soft spring rituals with blossom-filled sake. Solemn autumn nights beneath the moon. Even within the silence of the palace, there were days of laughter, of lantern light, of careful joy. The new year was the most elaborate. Robes of bright red and white were laid out the night before. Attendants braided new cords. Sweet rice cakes were prepared in silent kitchens, wrapped in leaves and tied with golden string. On the day itself, the emperor greeted his court. Concubines waited in order of rank, offering shallow bows, their faces calm, even as their hearts quickened with hope. Other festivals followed, the doll festival in spring, where figurines representing emperors and empresses were arranged in tiers and left beside trays of sweet sake and tiny shrimp. In summer came the star festival, Tanabata, when women wrote poems on strips of paper and hung them from bamboo, hoping the celestial lovers would meet above them. There were also quiet days of prayer for the dead, when incense curled upward from small altars, and the halls smelled of sandalwood and memory. Ceremony gave structure to palace life. Without it, the days would blur. With it, even sorrow had a place to rest. Outsiders and shadows, the world beyond the gates. She rarely thought of the world beyond the outer walls. Not because it wasn't real, but because it had become quiet within her. Distant, softened. A place she had once known, now pressed flat like a pressed blossom between the pages of a book. Letters came only occasionally. Her family, though noble, had learned not to ask questions. To serve in the court was both honor and silence. She thought sometimes of the streets, of the sound of sandals on stone, of the fish sellers calling at dawn, of the wet smell of riverbanks in spring. But such thoughts were not useful. The outer world was unpredictable, loud, full of hunger and heat. Here, in the palace, everything had shape and form. Even sorrow was folded neatly away. Visitors from the outside arrived rarely, and when they did, they carried the smell of wind and ash. Foreign, unsettling. She would watch them from behind the screen, marveling at their ease, their voices. And then when they left, she would return to her ink and her poem. The outside world no longer needed her. She belonged to the stillness now. Fading lanterns, when beauty becomes memory. Nothing in the court was permanent. Not the seasons, not favor, not even beauty. The life of a concubine was always suspended, like a lantern in the evening, glowing just long enough to be noticed before the oil ran low. She knew this from the moment she entered, and yet when the glow began to dim, it surprised her still. She first noticed it in the way others passed her in the corridor. Once they had bowed, even if only slightly. Once her sleeves had rustled with purpose. Now there was a softness to their steps, a gentleness that did not speak reverence, but something closer to farewell. She was not old, but in the court, youth faded not with age but with presence. There were newer faces now, younger women with delicate gestures, poems still hesitant on their tongues. They reminded her of herself, though she could never say so aloud. She did not resent them. Instead, she watched quietly, remembering the whisper of silk. Her silks were still fine, still dyed with seasonal precision, still scented faintly with plum blossom and ash, but no longer new. Attendants handled them more carefully now, not from reverence, but from age. The dye at the edges of one robe had begun to pale, and the embroidery on another had worn smooth from repeated folding. No one remarked on it, but she noticed. And in the quiet of her quarters, she began taking longer with her dress, not out of vanity, but out of ritual. She wanted to remember how it felt, to wrap herself in color, to become part of the moment, even as it passed. Though the palace complex was not large, the gardens wound cleverly around its perimeter. A space of miniature waterfalls, footbridges, and stone lanterns nestled beside gnarled pine. Here her fan accompanied her not as a conversation piece, but as a shield. The sun could be strong in summer, and the pale skin of a concubine was prized, not merely for beauty, but for what it implied, a life untouched by toil. As she walked, she held the fan just above her brow, turning it slightly to catch the breeze. The servants in the garden would pause and bow as she passed, never meeting her eyes. Her station was not the highest, but her poise granted her a kind of gravity. And all the while, the fan moved, never idle, never abrupt. It fluttered softly in rhythm with her breath. A petal fell across her shoulder. She brushed it away without breaking pace. The fan as gift and message. In Heian culture, fans were often exchanged as part of romantic or poetic correspondence. A man might write a verse upon a folded fan and leave it for his beloved under the leg of a lacquered stand or hidden within a wrapped gift of sweets. Her own collection of such fans was modest but meaningful. One, a fan painted with iris blossoms, had come from a scholar she had admired, though never met. It bore no name, only a poem. When the moon rises, behind iris-laden banks, who shall see my longing? She had replied, weeks later, with a silk thread tied through the fan's hinge. No words, only gesture. Another fan bore the symbol of a crane with a single inked word, return. That one she kept hidden in her writing box, unopened since the day she received it. She had never returned. Folding and unfolding memory. The act of folding and unfolding the fan became a metaphor, one not lost on the poets and philosophers of her day. To unfold the fan was to unveil one's thought. To fold it again was to close a chapter, to draw a curtain, to hold silence gently in both hands. At night, when the candles flickered low, she sometimes held the fan before her face and watched its shadows dance across the rice paper screens. It looked like wings, not of escape, but of ritual, repetition, grace. The fan was never truly still. It lay in her hand even as she listened, even as she dreamt, even as she aged. A farewell gesture. There is a record in a court diary, not hers, but one penned by a friend, of the final act of a concubine, who, sensing her time nearing its close, lifted her fan in a final gesture before the lamp was extinguished. It was not a performance. It was not meant to be seen, but it was recorded, quietly in the folds of memory passed from woman to woman. To lift the fan one last time, not to hide, but to greet the next silence, was considered the ultimate gesture of refinement. She too sometimes thought of this, not with fear, but with quiet admiration. And so, in the afternoon warmth of her chamber, where the light softens and the birds have gone quiet. She sits with her fan resting gently against her cheek. She does not speak, she does not move, and in her stillness the fan speaks for her. The ink-stained pillow book. Imagine yourself again in the hush of an early evening. The lamps are lit with gentle flame. The air is still, and somewhere behind closed screens, the rustle of silk is followed by the soft scrape of ink against paper. A woman sits cross-legged, brush in hand, leaning over a bound volume that holds not poetry or official record, but something much more intimate, her pillow book, the birth of a private chronicle. It began as a gift, not from a nobleman or lady, but from an elder attendant, once a court scribe herself. A bundle of carefully bound washi pages, stitched with thread the color of faded persimmon. The world forgets women's thoughts, the old scribe had whispered. Write them anyway. And so she had, not daily, not even weekly, but when the night was long and the oil in her lamp still generous, she would take up her brush and let her mind wander onto the paper. It was not a diary, not precisely. It was a makura no soshi, a pillow book, the kind kept tucked beneath bedding or within the folds of a wooden chest. It was filled with impressions, observations, verses half-formed, and thoughts too delicate for voice. The first page bore no title, just one line, things that stir the heart. Of lists and longing. The tradition of the pillow book allowed for lists, unstructured and poetic, that conveyed a woman's soul not through argument, but through atmosphere. In her pillow book, she had written, things that are beautiful when left incomplete. A folding screen with one panel left unpainted. The final stroke of a brush before the ink fades. A dream interrupted by birdsong. A love letter never sent. And later, things that cause quiet joy. The first sound of rain after a dry spell. A plum blossom blooming where one had not expected. The weight of a warm robe on cool skin. The moment when one realizes one is alone and safe and still. These lists were not meant for reading by others, and yet she chose each word as if they might be discovered long after her own voice had faded. The brush as confidant. The brush she used was slender, its bristles made from goat hair. She had only one. Replacing it would not be impossible, but something about its weight, the feel of it between her fingers, made it irreplaceable. She mixed her own ink. Water from the stone basin in her courtyard, poured carefully over the ink stick and ground into a smooth paste on the stone. The smell of the ink, earthy, faintly metallic, was as much a part of the ritual as the words themselves. And as she wrote, she often paused, not for thought, but for breath. Each line ended not with punctuation, but with a moment of stillness. Sometimes she would not write at all. She would simply open the pillow book, run her hand lightly across the page, and close it again, as if to say, I remember. Whispers behind screens. Within the court, it was known that many ladies kept pillow books. They were not forbidden, but they were also not discussed. One lady, older, sharp-witted, respected, had written, "A woman's soul lies between the strokes of her brush." Another had whispered over tea one evening, "They will never know us by our names, only by our margins." In her own book, she had once written, "Things that vanish faster than the morning fog." The laughter of another woman in the next chamber, the warmth of a glance at a poetry reading, the promise of a return, the weight of a dream before waking, the secret drawer. She did not keep her pillow book with her other scrolls or letters. It lived in a small drawer beneath her writing stand, tucked behind a cloth pouch of plum seeds and a single strip of sandalwood. The drawer was not locked, but few would think to open it. In this, she trusted more in invisibility than in force. Occasionally, she read back through her entries, not to correct or revise, but to trace her own changing seasons. The early pages were full of idealism, dreams of court life, verses about moonlight and longing glances. Later entries carried the scent of experience. They did not become bitter, only more precise. She wrote of the turning of robes with the year's first frost, of the ache in her shoulder from too many hours kneeling in silence, of the quiet grief in seeing another woman rise in rank while she remained, noticed but unchanged. Words that outlive the voice. One night, she wrote a short piece in the pillow book, not a list, but a memory. There was a time I sat beside the veranda and watched the rain gather in the grooves of the stepping stones. I do not recall the reason I was alone. I do not recall the scent of the air, only the stillness, only that the rain, for once, asked nothing of me. She read it aloud once, then closed the book. That memory remained nowhere else in the world. Not in another voice, not in another mind. Only here. Only hers. The book as companion. In winter, she sometimes placed the pillow book near her bedding, using it, as the name implied, quite literally. It warmed slightly under the covers, its edges soft from time and handling. On nights when she could not sleep, she reached for it, not to write, but to hold. Its weight was small, but comforting, like the echo of her own thoughts, wrapped in parchment. Sometimes she imagined that long after her robes had faded, long after her name had passed from record, someone might open this book and read things that were too beautiful to speak of aloud. And in that moment, they might know her. Not the titles, not the ranks, but the breath that lived between each line. Thus, the pillow book, like the fan, like the robe, became part of her silent legacy. Unseen by most, misunderstood by many, but quietly, unforgettably. The robes of 1,000 layers. Imagine yourself once more within the quiet, fragrant heart of a palace estate. The season has shifted. A breeze has turned cool, carrying the scent of moss and falling leaves. And within her chamber, a woman prepares, not for war, not for labor, but for being seen. She does so not with armor or paint, but with the slow, deliberate donning of robes. Many robes, more than most can imagine. This is the art of the Juni Hitoe, the 12-layered kimono, and sometimes more. The ritual of dressing. It begins long before the event itself. The summons had arrived the day before, an invitation to attend a seasonal poetry gathering in the presence of the Empress. Such occasions were rare. To be seen, even briefly, meant one must appear not only composed but radiant, understated in extravagance, and precise in every layer. The robes were removed from storage at dawn, each one wrapped in silk cloth, folded with care, marked for scent and condition. The dressing chamber is warm with anticipation, and softly lit by morning sun filtering through lattice. She stands in her underrobe, arms lifted gently as attendants prepare the layers. The first, soft linen, the base. Then come the hitoe, the unlined silk robes in whispering shades of autumn. One in faded persimmon, one in soft chrysanthemum yellow, another in deep river blue, reflecting the distant sky of the season. Layer by layer, the robes are arranged not by color alone, but by symbolism. Each hue chosen to evoke a feeling, a story, a seasonal truth. Together they create a palette only the most observant will fully understand. This is more than fashion, it is communication without words, the language of colors. To the trained eye, a woman's robes speak volumes. Wearing layers of willow green and pale gray in late spring, a nod to the fragility of the new season. Layers of plum and frost blue in early winter. A poetic reference to the last blossoms holding firm against the cold. Today, her chosen combination is one of refinement. Subtle rose, faded copper, ivory, and midnight ink. The etiquette of silent rivalry. Imagine yourself now, in a courtyard garden near mid-morning. The soft clack of wooden sandals drifts across stone, and the wind moves through the branches with the murmur of an old lullaby. Beyond the silken screens and shaded walkways, women pass each other with gentle nods, their voices never rising above a hush. In this place of refinement, rivalry does not arrive with raised voices or slamming doors. It arrives with a glance, with a poem, with the timing of an entrance. This is the art of silent rivalry, and in the world of the concubine, it is learned as early as calligraphy. A garden divided by shadows. The women live near each other, but not together. Their chambers are arranged along a long corridor, with gardens and walkways to separate and connect them. Proximity is power, but privacy is weapon and shield. She lives 3 doors from another favored concubine, a woman of great elegance, born to an older noble house, who once served tea to the emperor's brother, and who has never once spoken her name aloud. They do not quarrel. They bow. They exchange pleasantries in the presence of attendants. But beneath every sentence lies an echo of competition. And so, their rivalry is played like a board game left out under the eaves. Quiet, slow, deliberate. The politics of proximity. Where one is housed in the palace is no accident. The closer one's quarters to the emperor, the more one is seen. The more seen, the more favored. The more favored, the more hated, quietly. Rooms closer to the main hall catch the scent of incense from the emperor's shrine. They are warmer in winter. They hear footsteps of his approach first. And so, to be assigned a new room, even a small shift toward the center, is more than a change in real estate. It is an announcement. When she was moved 1 door closer, the neighboring concubine began placing camellias in her window. Camellias, in court language, whispered, "I am watching." The next day, she responded with a screen painting of willows, a symbol of flexible power. This was how messages were exchanged, not in words, but in symbols, like ghosts speaking through gardens. The duel of poetry. At gatherings, the women were expected to offer poems, often on a given theme. Snowfall, longing, the sound of rain on a summer roof. The empress would listen quietly as poems were recited aloud, or passed on folded fans or silken scrolls. In such moments, one did not simply write from the heart. One wrote with precision, with subtlety, and with the kind of restraint that said more in silence than in ink. She once submitted a verse that read, "The plum blooms early, though no one watches the branch. Still, it opens." The other woman responded with, "Petals may fall unseen, but the root remembers, always." No one commented, but the court remembered. Gestures that bite gently. Rivalry among concubines did not erupt in public. It unfurled in layers. The offering of slightly chilled tea instead of warm. The absence of greeting at a shared gathering. Or the carefully delayed delivery of a gift. A fan sent a day late. A poem left unsigned. A robe patterned with a season 2 weeks out of date. Subtle but clear. There was etiquette to these gestures. They could be denied. They could be explained away. And yet everyone knew. To accuse would be beneath one's rank. To respond with anger would break the illusion. So the game continued. A battle of appearances. Each morning became a quiet rehearsal. A contest of silhouettes glimpsed through translucent paper screens. The sound of hair being brushed. The scent of cloves burned in incense. The pattern on a robe glimpsed just before a doorway closes. She rose slightly earlier each day, had her robe ironed a little more precisely. Her calligraphy became more fluid, her voice more measured, but she never hurried, never showed strain, because to appear unbothered, to let the rivalry become invisible, was the greatest power of all. The emperor's gaze. He was the center around which all orbits turned, and yet he saw little of the tension. Or perhaps he saw and chose not to intervene. His gaze lingered longer on one concubine today, on another tomorrow. The shift of attention was like sunlight falling on different windows, and with each shift, the women felt the balance change, not in spoken favor, but in which poem he lingered over, which robe he glanced at, which tea he drank more fully. She learned not to hope, but to observe. Sometimes the emperor would pause before her, and in his silence she saw something, not desire, but respect. And that in court was far more rare. When rivalry softens. There was an evening when the rains had lasted 3 days. The halls were quieter. Even the cicadas seemed tired. She and the other concubine found themselves in the same corridor, walking slowly toward the kitchens. Neither spoke. The silence stretched long, until the other woman said softly, "I heard your poem about the willow root." She nodded, unsure whether to bow or continue walking. Then the woman added, "It made me remember my sister." Nothing more was said, but for a few days after, no camellias appeared in the windows. And when the next poetry gathering came, the other woman submitted a poem that did not answer hers, but complemented it. Rivalry without end. Still, it never vanished. Rivalry in the court was not a fire to be put out. It was a breeze, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, always present. She came to understand that in this world, such tensions were not cruel, but necessary. They sharpened awareness. They taught patience. They refined pride into elegance, and in the quiet rituals of rivalry, she had found strength, not loud, not celebrated, but enduring. She lay down that evening, not in victory, nor in defeat, but in stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you have remained composed, even as everything shifts beneath you. A music beneath the silence. Imagine a hush that's not quite quiet. a stillness that hums just beneath the surface of things. That is the feeling of life inside the inner quarters of a noble Japanese residence. Here, sound does not dominate. It weaves gently, deliberately, around acts of waiting, reading, watching. But within this world of silence, music is not absent, it is essential. It rises not to thrill, but to soothe, to remind the listener, softly, of grace, of time, of breath. This is not performance, it is presence. The instruments of the court, within the chambers of the concubines, music is never loud. Instead, it emerges like mist, slowly, with reverence. The koto, a long zither with 13 silk strings, sits low to the ground like a sleeping river. The biwa, a short-necked lute, leans against the lacquered wall, its curves echoing the stillness of the crescent moon. In some rooms, the soft echo of a show, a small mouth organ, hums like wind, trapped in a bamboo grove. No orchestras, no clapping, just solitary sound, played for no one but the room itself. A lesson in slowness. The concubine does not learn music to perform. She learns to understand the gaps between notes. Her music teacher, an older woman who once sang for a now-dead prince, insists on silence between phrases. "Too much sound," she once murmured, "and you drown the spirit." So she practices with restraint. A single note, then a pause, then another. Her fingers glide over the strings of the koto like they are tracing memories in water. She listens, not only for beauty, but for restraint, because in this world, beauty is never urgent. Music for no one. Sometimes she plays in the early morning, when the sky is just beginning to shift. The air is damp. A teacup sits cooling beside her. She does not expect to be heard, and yet she knows a passing serve, a fellow concubine in the room beyond might sit a little longer in her dressing. Even the garden listens. The notes do not rise to the rafters. They stay low, near the floor, near the soil, near the heart. A shared song in spring. There was a morning, near the time of plum blossoms, when she played a duet with another. The other woman had a shamisen, 3 strings plucked gently with a slender plectrum. They had never spoken much, but in music, words were unnecessary. They sat beneath the painted screen of cranes in flight. Their instruments faced opposite directions, like the roots of different trees growing toward the same stream. They did not choose a song. They simply began. One string sang, the other answered, then paused, like poetry, like breath. When they stopped, they did not bow. They only nodded, a quiet agreement that the moment had happened and would not return. The music of letters. There is another kind of music here. The rustle o. She writes often, late at night, her sleeves drawn back, inkstone warmed slightly by her palm. The sound of brush on paper is a song all its own, a sweeping arc for a longing word, a sharp flick for a pointed remark. Even pauses carry meaning. The moment she holds her hand still above the paper, waiting for the right image to arrive. This, too, is music. No audience, no applause, only the knowledge that somewhere, someone may read and understand the rhythm. Autumn and the falling note. In autumn, she plays fewer melodies. Instead, she sits with the instrument untouched, fingers resting on the strings like a silent prayer. The wind outside plays its own tune. the crunch of fallen leaves beneath sandals, the whisper of robes brushed aside, the distant call of a temple bell. Sometimes she thinks the best music is never played, only imagined, a memory in sound. She remembers a night when thunder rolled through the hills. The other women had gathered in one chamber, lamps flickering, robes clutched close. Someone asked her to play. She hesitated, and then placed her hands on the koto. Just 3 notes, and a silence. Then 2 more, each note like a raindrop landing on the roof, each pause deeper than the sound itself. The storm outside paused, as if listening. They didn't speak afterward, but the next morning, someone left a folded poem at her door. It read, "Your notes fell like plum blossoms, and the wind forgot its name." The echo that remains, now late at night, when her chamber is dark and the embers low, she still hears it. Not music exactly, but the space where music once was. The instrument rests untouched. The air is still, and yet a faint echo lingers. The memory of a note, a breath, a gesture. In that, she finds sleep, not silence, but the soft, remembered hum of everything left unspoken. Perfume games and the scent of memory. Imagine a room filled with the fragrance of sandalwood and plum blossom, faint as a memory. In the world of the concubine, scent is not an accessory. It is language, armor, and identity. No perfume is worn without purpose. No fragrance goes unnoticed. A woman may pass silently down a hallway, but those who inhale the air after her will know exactly who she was. And in courtly life, where glances are fleeting and words are weighed, the lingering scent of a robe may speak more honestly than anything else. The incense chamber. The preparation begins in a quiet room known as the Kodo no Ma, the incense chamber. Here, everything is dim and still. Attendants kneel before polished boxes, unfolding layers of silk to reveal delicate, carved incense burners, pouches of precious woods, and folded strips of scented paper. The concubine enters slowly, her sleeves drawn back to avoid brushing against the delicate instruments. She bows slightly to the master of incense, an older woman with a serene face and fingertips stained from years of powdered resins. Incense is not burned directly, she's reminded. It is warmed, like memory itself. Too much heat, and it is destroyed. Too little, and it never fully awakens. The lesson is simple: to coax scent, not to demand it. The game of fragrance. Among the aristocracy, there exists an elegant pastime, kodo, the way of incense. It is not a game of speed or laughter. It is a quiet contest of perception, restraint, and memory. A small group of women sits in a circle. A single incense is prepared and passed, hidden inside a small koro or burner. Each woman inhales gently, not directly, and then writes down her impression on a folded slip of paper. Is it plum? Aged agarwood? Is there a note of green bamboo? Or something more elusive? Something like moonlight after snow. The winner is not always the most correct, but the most poetic. The one who names the unnamed. Scent as identity. She crafts her personal fragrance with care, a mixture of dried plum blossom, trace sandalwood, and the rare shavings of Chiara, a dark, resinous wood, more valuable than gold. This scent is placed within her sleeves, warmed gently before gatherings, fanned across her letters with thin pieces of incense paper. Others begin to recognize her not by footstep or voice, but by the air she leaves behind. When she enters a garden, someone remarks, "The scent of early spring has arrived." She does not reply. The scent replies for her. Perfumed letters. Letters, too, carry perfume. Before she sends one, she folds it around a small slip of incense-soaked paper, just enough to cling to the fibers. By the time the message is opened, the scent has become a part of it. The reader inhales before reading, and then reads differently. Words wrapped in scent seem more alive, more private, more Dre. And when she receives a letter with no perfume at all, it feels strangely cold, as if something essential was left behind. Memory in the fabric. Even robes remember. After a gathering, her outer kimono is folded and stored. But when she opens the cedar box weeks later, the perfume still lingers. Not just the mixture she applied, but the mingling of every scent that surrounded her that day. The tea, the room, the laughter of a distant courtier, the sadness in a verse she read aloud. Fragrance holds what the mind cannot. Inhaling it, she remembers moments she thought she had forgotten. Scent and intrigue. There are other uses for scent, subtler, less kind. A concubine may release a slight whiff of musk in a corridor where another is expected to pass, or send a robe to the wash, scented with the same mixture worn by a rival, stirring quiet confusion. These are games played without rules and without guilt. Because in this world, the line between art and strategy is thinner than a wisp of smoke. Scent of the absent. He once favored her, the emperor. She does not see him now as often. His gaze has drifted, as it always does. But one evening, a servant returned from his chambers and whispered, "His pillow still smells of plum and cedar." She said nothing, but that night, she slept with her sleeve tucked close to her cheek. Not to remember him, but to remember who she was when he remembered. A scent that lingers. Even now, as the room dims and the coals fade, her chamber holds traces of her day. A faint sweetness, a note of wood, the breath of a flower that never bloomed. She lies still, eyes closed, surrounded by what cannot be seen. The past drifts around her, not in memory, but in air. And as sleep approaches, she knows, though the world may forget her name, it will remember her scent. ... The art of folding time. Letters, poetry, and the pillow book. Imagine the delicate rustle of paper, the faint scent of ink and perfume mingling in the air. In the quiet solitude of her chamber, the concubine's thoughts unfold onto fragile sheets, folded and refolded, carried by the softest winds of memory and desire. Here, time is not measured by clocks or seasons, but by the letters written, poems exchanged, and the intimate pages of the pillow book, a private diary where dreams and realities intertwine. In this chapter, we enter a world where writing is not only communication, but a subtle art of presence, absence, and longing. The quiet world of the pillow book. The pillow book, or Makura no Soshi, is a private journal kept hidden beneath the sleeping mat or tucked away in a lacquered box. Unlike letters meant to be sent, The pillow book is an archive of thoughts, dreams, sketches, and fleeting impressions. It is a diary of the concubine's inner world, her joys, fears, moments of loneliness, and delicate observations of life around her. The pages are filled with lists of favorite poems, seasonal flowers, the appearance of the moon, the sound of rain on the garden roof. Each entry is like a folded piece of time, preserved not for others, but for herself. A way to hold on to the rhythm of her days as they pass softly and quietly. The ritual of letter writing. When a message must cross the distance to another, whether to the emperor, a trusted attendant, or a close friend, the act of letter writing becomes a ritual steeped in intention and care. The paper is chosen carefully, usually thin, slightly translucent washi, soft to the touch, and warm from being held. The ink is ground slowly on a stone, the dark liquid pooling like quiet thought in a shallow dish. The brush is dipped, then lifted in deliberate strokes, each character flowing with the grace of a willow branch swaying in a gentle breeze. There is no rush here. Each word is considered, each line folded with precision, the letter sealed with a pressed flower or a dab of wax infused with subtle scent. The letter is not simply a message, it is a presence. A trace of the writer's hand, a whisper carried through the air. Poetry as a bridge. Poetry weaves throughout this world like soft thread, binding moments, people, and feelings together. A poem may be written in response to a letter received or sent alone, a gift of thought and spirit. Themes often revolve around nature. The fleeting bloom of a cherry blossom, the quiet fall of autumn leaves, the reflection of the moon on a still pond. But beneath these images lies a deeper language. Longing, hope, regret, or admiration. The concubine often composes verses to send with gifts or to leave as subtle messages in the court. A poem could hint at a desire for closeness or signal a gentle warning without ever speaking aloud. The art is in suggestion, in what is left unspoken between the lines, folding time and space. The letters themselves are folded into precise shapes, rectangles, triangles, and sometimes intricate designs resembling cranes or other auspicious symbols. Folding is not merely functional, it is a part of the message. The care in folding reflects the respect for the recipient and the desire to preserve the intimacy of the written word. To unfold a letter is to open a moment suspended in time, to participate in a private conversation that travels unseen through hallways, gardens, and seasons. The exchange of secrets. Beyond official correspondence, secret notes pass between favored concubines or trusted servants. These notes are often brief, a few characters written in minute script, tucked inside a sleeve or beneath a floor mat. Their content might include news from outside the palace, words of encouragement, or quiet sympathies shared in the solitude of court life. In this way, writing becomes a lifeline, a means of connection amid the solitude, intrigue, and the ever-shifting tides of favor and disfavor. The sensory world of ink and paper. The texture of the paper, the scent of the ink, and the sound of brush on silk combine to create a sensory experience as important as the words themselves. Some papers carry the faint fragrance of plum blossom or pine resin, meant to soothe the reader's spirit. Ink may be mixed with ground minerals that give it a soft shimmer, catching the light like morning dew. Even the act of folding produces a delicate sound, a soft crease, like the whisper of a bird's wing. Together, these sensations turn writing into a ritual of mindfulness and presence. The pillow book as memory and meditation. The pillow book is both a record and a refuge. It holds the passing seasons, the shifting alliances, the quiet moments of joy, and the deep wells of sorrow. In writing, the concubine folds herself into time, finding order in the unpredictable rhythms of palace life. Each entry is a meditation, a way to hold fast to identity amid the tides of change. Letters as legacy. Though many letters are meant to be read once and then hidden away, some survive, treasured by descendants or preserved in archives. They become fragments of history, glimpses into the intimate lives of women who rarely appear in official records. Through these fragile documents, voices long silenced still speak softly across centuries. A moment of stillness. As the day draws to a close and the lamps burn low, the concubine lays down her brush. She folds the last letter of the evening with care, tucks it beneath a silk ribbon, and places it in a small wooden box. The room is thick with the scent of incense and ink, the soft rustle of paper a lullaby. And as sleep pulls her gently downward, she knows she has folded not just paper, but time itself, preserving moments, memories, and a sense of self in the quiet unfolding of history. The quiet art of tea, ceremony, preparation, and presence. Imagine a small, serene room bathed in soft morning light, where the air is tinged with the delicate scent of steamed matcha powder and the gentle sound of water flowing over stone. Within the world of the concubine, the tea ceremony is more than ritual. It is a meditation, a moment of stillness and grace amid the swirling currents of court life. Here, every movement is deliberate, every breath measured. The tea is not just a drink, but a bridge between guests and hosts, between body and mind, between past and present. The path to the tea room. To reach the tea room, the concubine walks along a garden path, soft underfoot with moss and fallen leaves. Each step is mindful, paced to match the gentle rhythm of the water trickling in a nearby stream. Stone lanterns stand quietly at intervals, their carved faces softened by the morning mist. The air carries the scent of wet earth and pine, mingled with the faintest hint of incense from the residence. Passing beneath the low wooden gate, she removes her shoes, feeling the coolness of the tatami beneath her feet. The tea room's quiet embrace. Inside, the tea room is small and humble, its walls made of paper and wood, designed to blur the boundary between indoors and out. The space is sparse, illuminated softly by a single paper lantern. A simple scroll hangs on the wall, bearing a calligraphic poem, a reminder of impermanence and calm. The concubine kneels upon the woven mat, her posture poised yet relaxed. There is no hurry, only the steady, quiet breathing of the room. The ceremony begins. The tea master enters, carrying the tools of the ceremony with reverence. The bamboo whisk, chasen, the tea scoop, chashaku, the iron kettle, kama. The kettle's water is already boiling softly. Its steam, rising like a slow breath. The tea master bows gently, and then begins the ritual of preparation. Every movement is deliberate. Scooping powdered green tea, pouring hot water, whisking the tea into a frothy, pale green liquid. The sound of the whisk is soft but clear, a rhythm that fills the stillness. The taste of mindfulness. When the tea is ready, it is passed carefully to the concubine. She receives the bowl with both hands, lifting it to her lips slowly. The first sip is bitter, sharp like the moment between waking and dreaming. But with each swallow, the bitterness softens, replaced by a subtle sweetness and a lingering earthiness. She closes her eyes briefly, savoring the taste and the warmth spreading through her chest. This is more than refreshment, it is presence, the exchange of gratitude. After the tea is shared, there is a moment of silence, a mutual acknowledgement of effort and respect. The concubine bows slightly to the tea master. The tea master replies in kind. No words are needed here. The exchange is felt in the quiet space between them. The spiritual underpinning. The tea ceremony is rooted in wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection, impermanence, and simplicity. In this room, cracked bowls and rough textures are cherished, reminders that beauty is found in the humble and the transient. For the concubine, participating in the ceremony is a brief escape from the polished facades of Co. Here she connects with a deeper sense of self, one that is not defined by status or favor, but by quiet grace. Preparation as meditation. The ritual extends beyond the ceremony itself. Each tool is cared for meticulously. The whisk rinsed and dried, the bowls gently wiped, the bamboo scoop polished. This act of preparation is itself a meditation, a way to ground the mind and find calm in repetition. The concubine often helps with these tasks, learning the rhythm and the reverence required, the garden and the ceremony. The tea room opens onto a small garden, designed for contemplation. Before and after the ceremony, the concubine wanders the stones and moss, letting the natural world wash over her. The soft rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird, the ripple of water in a stone basin, all become part of the experience. The garden is a reminder that life, like tea, is fleeting and ever-changing. The ceremony's quiet legacy. Even after the guests have departed and the tools are stored away, the stillness of the ceremony lingers. It seeps into the concubine's thoughts, a soft anchor in the shifting tides of court life. As she retires to her chamber, the memory of tea, its taste, its sound, its silence, stays with her, a gentle companion in the night. The rhythm of night, sleep, dreams in the quiet hours. Imagine the soft dimming of light as twilight gently descends upon the ancient wooden halls. The air cools, carrying whispers of pine and distant water. Within the private chambers of the concubine, the day's bustle fades into stillness. Sleep, a fragile and sacred visitor, arrives slowly, wrapped in the quiet rhythms of the night. This chapter invites you to settle gently into those quiet hours, where dreams mingle with memories, and the pulse of life slows to a whispered lullaby. A slow dimming of day. As the sun dips below the horizon, shadows lengthen, and the colors of the world soften. The walls of the residence glow faintly in the warm amber light of oil lamps and flickering candles. Curtains of translucent paper diffuse the last of the daylight, casting gentle patterns across tatami mats. The concubine prepares for the night with deliberate care, folding robes, arranging pillows, and settling into the stillness. The evening ritual before sleep. Small rituals mark the passage from day to night. A quiet moment at the altar. Incense lit. A silent prayer whispered. A sip of warm herbal tea, calming the body and soothing the spirit. The rustle of silk as the day's garments are exchanged for soft night robes. Each action performed slowly, like a meditation, easing the mind toward rest. The chamber's soft embrace. The sleeping room is simple but comforting. A futon laid atop the straw mat, layered with smooth silks and fine linen. Pillows filled with fragrant herbs, their subtle aroma mingling with the cool night air. The scent of plum blossoms, mingled with the faint trace of sandalwood, lingers gently. The concubine lies down, the fabric cool against her skin, the world narrowing to this quiet space. The dance of dreams. Sleep here is not always deep or uninterrupted. Dreams come like fleeting visitors, some gentle and serene, others more elusive. They carry fragments of the day's thoughts, whispered fears, and hopes folded tight. Sometimes the dream is a garden in spring, petals falling like soft rain. Sometimes it is the distant sound of a flute, echoing across a misty lake. The concubine learns to receive these dreams without clinging, letting them pass like clouds. The rhythm of breath. Breathing slows naturally as the body relaxes. The steady in and out becomes a rhythm, a quiet drum guiding the mind. The room grows still except for this gentle movement, a connection to life. The concubine focuses on this breath, letting it carry her gently deeper into rest. Night sounds and silence. Outside the chamber, the world is alive in its own quiet way. The rustle of leaves stirred by a light breeze, the distant call of a night bird, the soft drip of water from stone gutters after a light rain. These sounds form a subtle backdrop, a natural symphony of the night. They remind the concubine she is part of a larger world, even in solitude. The gift of rest. Sleep is a reprieve from the demands of court and the constant shifting of favor. In these hours, the concubine's mind and body find restoration. The cares of the day are folded away, replaced by the gentle balm of rest. Each night brings renewal, a chance to greet the morning with quiet strength. The whisper of time. In the stillness, the passage of time feels both vast and intimate. Moments stretch and contract, folding into one another like the delicate folds of a silk kimono. The night hours hold a different kind of presence, not of action, but of being. Here the concubine is neither courtier nor servant, but simply a woman wrapped in shadow and moonlight. The first light of dawn. As darkness slowly yields to dawn, the room begins to glow faintly with pale light. Birdsong filters softly through open screens. The concubine stirs, the rhythms of sleep dissolving like mist. The new day waits quietly, full of possibility and subtle shifts. She rises slowly, carrying the calm of night into the unfolding hours ahead. The cycle continues, and so the rhythm of night completes the cycle of day. The quiet hours of rest dreams, and renewal are as essential as the bright bustle of morning. For the concubine, these cycles shape the very fabric of her life. Moments of stillness threading through the constant flow of courtly existence. As you imagine yourself here, in this tranquil space, may the gentle rhythm of night bring you peace, and the quiet hours carry you softly toward rest. The rise of a concubine, early life, and introduction to court. Imagine a quiet village nestled among rolling hills, where the air is thick with the scent of rice paddies and blooming chrysanthemums. Here begins the journey of a young girl destined to enter the palace, her world slowly unfolding beyond the familiar rhythms of rural life. This chapter traces the gentle steps of her early years, the family, traditions, and the quiet dreams that will guide her toward a life within the elegant yet complex world of the imperial court. A childhood among fields and shadows. The girl was born in late spring, when the rains softened the soil and lotus flowers stirred in the ponds. Her family was of minor nobility, respected though distant from power, and lived modestly on the edge of a provincial town. Her father, a scholar in quiet retirement, spent hours beneath a veranda of vines, teaching poetry and the classics to neighboring sons. Her mother, graceful and reserved, oversaw the household with soft authority, whispering lessons through gesture more than word. From a young age, the girl observed more than she spoke. She watched the village women carry baskets balanced on hips, heard the rhythmic hum of spinning wheels, and felt the cool mud squish between her toes as she walked barefoot beside the family garden. It was in this quiet world that she first learned stillness, how to listen, how to wait, how to notice. Lessons in grace. As she grew, her days became structured, not by play, but by refinement. Her mother guided her through the art of presence, how to walk without sound, how to bow with the correct degree of depth, how to smile without baring too many teeth. Her fingers learned to fold paper precisely, to thread fine needles through silk, and to sweep calligraphy brushes in slow, balanced strokes. When she poured tea, she was taught to notice the temperature of the cup, the steadiness of her hand, and the placement of her gaze. Every motion was deliberate, every detail was a thread in the fabric of dignity. At night, her father would read aloud by lantern light. He told her of ancient poets and legendary empresses, of times when women wrote verses so delicate they changed the mood of an emperor. Her heart stirred, not with ambition but with a quiet wonder, a longing to live where words and presence meant something more. A visitor brings change. One summer, when she had just entered her 14th year, a distant cousin from the capital visited their home. He wore layered robes of subdued plum and charcoal, his speech sharp and practiced, his gaze both kind and distant. At the evening meal, he watched her closely, not rudely, but with measured observation. The next morning, he spoke privately with her parents, beneath the veranda's shade, his voice low, his tone formal. Later, her mother knelt beside her and smoothed a lock of hair from her brow. "You may have a place," she said softly, "in the court." The words settled like falling petals, not loud, not sudden, but final, preparing for departure. The seasons turned swiftly. By autumn, her trunks were being packed. She was given new garments in shades of soft persimmon and willow green. Her hair, now grown long, was combed and oiled until it gleamed like black lacquer, A tutor arrived from the city to polish her manner of speech, her knowledge of court poetry, and her understanding of seasonal etiquette. Her nights were filled with dreams, not of grandeur, but of gardens she had never seen, of distant halls lined with lanterns, and of whispers carried through silk screens. She said farewell to the fields and to her childhood with quiet ceremony. Her mother held her long and close, then turned away before tears could reach her cheek. Arrival at the capital. The road to the capital stretched through valleys and rising hills, the days long but calm. She traveled with a small retinue, led by the cousin who had noticed her months before. When they finally arrived, the city unfolded like a painted scroll. Wide avenues, tiled roofs shimmering in the late sun, gardens walled in stone, and banners fluttering with imperial crests. Her lodging near the palace grounds was humble, yet cleaner and more silent than she had imagined. The air smelled of cedar and plum. The morning after her arrival, she was summoned. First glimpse of court. Her first steps into the outer precincts of the court were taken with her eyes lowered. The corridor floors gleamed like mirrors. Voices drifted from unseen places, polite, clipped, and measured. She was led through a side passage, through shaded verandas and fragrant corridors, until she reached a room with pale screens and a waiting attendant. The attendant spoke softly. "You will wait here. You will be seen." She knelt. She folded her hands. Her breath was slow, but her heart trembled like a single reed in wind. Minutes passed, or hours. Then, soft footsteps. A high-ranking lady entered, her robes trailing like mist. She did not speak much. She observed. She asked her name, her lineage. She studied her posture. Then she nodded once. "You may remain." A life begins. She was not immediately placed in the emperor's inner circle. That would come later. But her presence was now part of the palace. She learned the sounds of court, the murmur of conversations behind doors, the shuffle of slippers on polished floors, the distant echo of instruments in the evening. She rose early, practiced her writing, folded letters, arranged flowers, attended to senior women, and watched everything. And slowly, without fanfare, she was woven into the fabric of the palace. A new thread, fine and soft, but steady. Reflection in candlelight. In her chamber, she would sometimes gaze into the flame of her small oil lamp and recall the fields of her childhood. She did not mourn them, not yet, but she carried them within her, like a folded paper crane nestled in the sleeve of her robe. Her world was of incense and ceremony, of polished speech and veiled meanings. And though she was still young, she understood that she had crossed a threshold, from daughter to presence, from observer to part of the story. She was now within the world that moved beneath the emperor's gaze. Not yet chosen, not yet favored, but present and waiting. A place among the petals, training, adaptation, and early friendships. Imagine a courtyard just after a spring rain, where petals fall silently from the cherry trees and settle on the polished stones like quiet confessions. Within the palace, the young concubine finds herself adrift in a sea of beauty, silence, and unspoken rules. She is no longer the girl of the countryside. Each day she is reshaped by ritual, rhythm, and the presence of others like her. Girls who walk the same echoing corridors, who kneel in the same early light, who carry the same silent questions in their eyes. And so begins her slow transformation into one of them, a woman of the palace, of gesture, of grace. Days of observation. Her earliest weeks in court were not marked by events, but by watching. The palace was vast and layered like a scroll slowly unrolled, revealing rooms behind rooms, screens behind screens, meanings beneath meanings. Each day began early, long before the sun crested the outer walls. She rose in the dim light, dressed carefully under the eye of a senior attendant, and made her way to the morning rituals. There was never any rush. Time within the palace moved differently, like ink spreading slowly on silk. A thing could be said without being spoken. A gesture could hold the weight of a command. She learned this not through instruction, but through stillness. Through watching the older women speak with their eyes, move without sound, and bow with breathless precision. Lessons in presence. Formal instruction came gradually. A quiet room, an older teacher with pale hands, and a low table covered in scrolls and small bowls of ink. She was taught how to write in different hands, one for poetry, one for letters, one for ceremony. She practiced speaking softly, clearly, and only when spoken to. Her walk was refined, one hand always just above her waist, sleeves arranged like gentle waterfalls, feet sliding rather than stepping. She learned the scent of each incense used for different times of day. She learned how to smile with the eyes alone, the importance of hair and silence. Hair was no small matter. Each morning, it was brushed 100 times until it shone like water at dusk. It was oiled, coiled, pinned, and adorned according to her status. Not too elaborate, never plain. To touch one's hair too often was seen as vain. To leave a strand loose was careless. Even silence had its varieties. There was the silence of obedience, the silence of mourning, the silence of respect, and the silence of waiting. She came to understand which was which, and when each was required. Small bonds in a vast world. Though formality was expected, warmth was not absent. There were other girls near her age, some born to wealth, others to provincial households like hers. They were not friends in the ordinary sense, but they were companions in solitude. Together they folded cloth, arranged flowers, and whispered poems beneath their breath. In one girl named Aoi, she found a soft mirror. Aoi, with her moon-round face and sharp eyes, could recite verses with playful ease. They would sometimes lie on the woven mats, reciting ancient tales of fox spirits and noble lovers, trading lines like lullabies. Laughter, though rare, did happen, but always behind the hand and always under breath. The Garden of the Hidden Moon. One evening, a senior lady led them to a walled garden, hidden between the sleeping quarters and the western veranda. This was the Garden of the Hidden Moon, a space known only to the women of the palace. Here, in the quiet hours, they were permitted to walk without shoes, to sit beneath the plum trees, to speak more freely. The concubine felt something shift in her chest that evening, a soft settling, as though the court, once so cold and faceless, had made room for her. The arrival of petals. Spring arrived in waves. Cherry trees bloomed in courtyards, their petals falling like soft snow. The palace corridors were swept daily, yet always carried the trace of blossoms. The concubine began to feel that her own heart mirrored this season, delicate, uncertain, slowly opening. One morning she rose before dawn, and slipped outside to stand beneath a blooming branch. She looked up at the pale sky and watched a single petal fall into her palm. In that moment, she felt it, a quiet joy of belonging. Not to a person, not yet. Not to a person, not yet, but to a place, to a rhythm, to the slow unfolding of self within a larger pattern. Letters from home. Occasionally, letters arrived from her family, written in her father's precise brushstrokes or her mother's more graceful hand. They spoke of rice harvests, of the new dog, of her younger brother's clumsy attempts at poetry. The letters brought tears to her eyes, but never out loud. She would fold them gently, press them between layers of linen, and reread them by candlelight. They reminded her of who she had been, and who she was slowly becoming. A new kind of grace. It wasn't simply beauty that was taught in the court. It was grace, a way of being that held the body like a poem, that moved with calm, that bowed without shame. The concubine began to feel this grace settle into her bones. It was not pride, it was not ambition. It was simply the comfort of knowing how to stand, how to serve tea, how to carry silence as though it were silk. She no longer worried she would make a mistake. She simply moved, soft, steady, unseen, yet present. The first audience, when the day finally came for her to be presented in the outer audience chamber, not yet to the emperor, but to the noble ladies, she was ready. She wore layered robes of soft lavender and ice blue. Her hair was adorned with a single comb of jade. Her heart beat steadily, not fast. She entered, bowed deeply, and waited. The ladies spoke among themselves. One, an older noblewoman with hair like silver thread, glanced her way. "She is composed," she said, "a quiet one." No more was said, but that was enough, becoming a petal in the wind. By the end of her second season, the concubine was no longer merely a girl from the provinces. She had become one of them, under the emperor's gaze. First encounters and courtly uncertainty. The first time the emperor's name brushed against her life, it came not in fanfare but in silence. A folded message. A shift in the gaze of the senior attendants. And then, one morning, the rustle of silk behind a lattice screen. A subtle summoning. The news did not arrive in spoken form. It came in a note, thin paper, folded once, placed beside her breakfast tray. There were no words of praise or explanation. Only a time and a place. The moon viewing pavilion. Just before dusk. She understood what it meant. An audience, a test, or perhaps merely a presence. A way for the emperor to observe, to assess, without committing anything at all. She bowed to the paper before tucking it into her sleeve. Dressing without expectation. She was not told what to wear, and so she chose her simplest layered robe. Ash gray and soft blue, the colors of clouds before rain. Her hair was brushed until it shone, held in place with a comb of carved bone, and a trace of plum blossom oil was smoothed onto her sleeves. Others might have worn jewels or embroidery. But she knew, too much display could seem desperate, too little, careless. She walked the garden path slowly, watching the pale light filter through the branches above. Spring had not yet arrived, but the air smelled of its promise. The moon viewing pavilion. The pavilion stood at the edge of a reflecting pool, half wrapped in willows, its pillars lacquered dark with age. It was quiet. A single lantern had been lit, near the entrance, casting long shapes onto the water. Inside, two other concubines waited, both older than her, their faces unreadable behind layers of grace. They did not speak, only nodded. Moments passed. Then the emperor arrived. A presence without announcement. There were no trumpets, no fanfare, just a shift in the air, as though the garden itself bowed. He moved with quiet authority, dressed in muted gold and ivory, his expression mild, his eyes unreadable. He looked at each of them, not long, and then he sat, requesting a reading. The eldest concubine recited a classical verse, rich with metaphor. The second offered a poem of longing, her voice slow and honeyed. When her turn came, she chose a verse of her own, quiet, brief, but carefully crafted. It spoke of seasons turning, of silent waters, of unseen reflection. The emperor's eyes met hers, just for a breath. Then he nodded. Nothing more. Ripples in the court. She returned to her quarters without expression. She bowed. She undressed. She ate in silence. But the next morning, her senior attendant offered her tea with a slightly deeper bow. A new robe was delivered. Soft violet and pale cream. And in the hallway, a few glances lingered longer than before. Favor was never declared outright. It lived in subtleties, in changed schedules, improved rooms, more invitations to private events. Nothing had been said, yet everything had shifted. Stillness amid possibility. She did not allow herself hope. The court was full of half-favored women. Some had once been near the emperor, only to fall into years of quiet irrelevance. Attention was fleeting. A single phrase could end it. So she continued with her duties, attending poetry sessions, practicing flower arrangement, walking alone in the snow-dusted courtyard at dawn. But within her, something had stirred. Not ambition, not pride, just awareness that her presence had been seen and remembered, and that, in the palace, was no small thing. The veil of jealousy, rivalry, caution, and secrets. The deeper one stepped into the palace, the softer the footsteps had to be. Not because of fear, but because too many things lived beneath the surface. Favor, envy, caution, and ambition threaded their way silently through the corridors. For the young concubine, newly brushed by imperial attention, this was the moment her world grew more beautiful and more perilous. The change in atmosphere. It did not take long. The change was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. Before, other women had looked through her, politely, distantly, without judgment. Now their gazes arrived with quiet sharpness, like needles slipping through silk. There were no harsh words, only smiles that lingered too long, polite greetings that seemed to weigh more than they should. She began to feel the tension in the air, not constant, but present, like the faint scent of ash in an otherwise pleasant room. No one confronted her, but nothing went unnoticed. Unspoken rules. In the court, jealousy was not expressed. It was implied. The way someone might rearrange a tea gathering so that she was seated farther from the fire. The sudden absence of a servant who had always helped her dress. The way her favorite flowers were quietly removed from the morning arrangements. Even poems read aloud at court could carry hidden messages. A verse about withered blossoms. A reference to fleeting beauty. A story about a star that disappeared from the emperor's sky. She had to read between the lines, not just in writing, but in every conversation. Quiet guidance. One afternoon, as she practiced calligraphy in her room, an older court lady arrived with a tray of dried persimmons and 2 cups of tea. The woman had once been close to the emperor. Now she lived in quiet shadow, content in her poetry, ignored by rivals. She said nothing directly, but as they sipped their tea together, her voice was low and rhythmic. Sometimes, she said, the best way to be seen is to be invisible at the right moments. The young concubine nodded slowly, understanding more than the words alone, watching and being watched. From then on, she paid greater attention to where people stood in gatherings, to how robes were chosen, bold or understated, to the way glances passed, unnoticed by most. Like hidden threads in a tapestry, she learned who whispered to whom, who favored which musicians, who visited the emperor's mother on quiet days. And she learned how to move more carefully, not smaller, but more gently, with deliberation, letting the silence gather around her like mist. She did not try to win anyone. She simply let herself fade into the background when needed, and reappear when it mattered. A whisper in the garden. One evening, as she walked the narrow path along the plum orchard, a younger concubine passed her. No bow, no smile. Only a quiet sentence, dropped like a pebble into a pond. Don't forget, blossoms are most easily bruised at their peak. Then she was gone, sleeves trailing behind her like a shadow. The concubine paused, letting the words settle. She looked at the blooming tree beside her. White petals against a darkening sky, and she understood. Beauty had power, but it also had enemies. ... A season of subtle grace, holding ground without winning favor. In a world where attention flickered like lantern light on water, she learned that survival was not about shining, but enduring. While others reached upward like spring branches desperate for sunlight, she chose a slower rhythm, one of stillness, patience, and measured breath. A quiet season began, and in that season, she grew. The strategy of steadiness. After the first audience, and after the whispers that followed, there came a lull. The emperor did not summon her again. He saw other women, walked with them in the gardens, dined in silken chambers where her name was not spoken. And yet, nothing fell apart. She was not dismissed. She was not forgotten. Her name remained on the schedule for tea gatherings. Her quarters were kept warm. Her place in the daily rituals remained unchanged. This, she learned, was a kind of favor in itself. In the palace, to remain steady was rare. To neither rise nor fall too quickly was a mark of someone learning how to exist without drawing too much wind. Presence without pressure. She became a figure known for her stillness. At poetry readings, she would listen more than speak. At incense blending ceremonies, her hands moved gracefully without hesitation. She wore muted colors, dusty plum, faded ivory, ink-brushed gray. Others dressed in crimson or gold, chasing the eye of the emperor like moths. She let herself blend into the shadows of screens, to be noticed only when someone truly looked. And when they did, they often looked longer. Kindness in small places. In this quieter season, she found herself building a different kind of strength, not through power, but through trust. She offered gentle advice to younger girls in their first days at court. She wrote poems for the older attendants when they had family visit. She remembered names. She offered silence when others needed space. and slowly a web of quiet goodwill formed around her. Not flashy, not political, but strong. Those who had once been curious now began to smile when she entered the room. Even those who had whispered grew quiet. Letters not sent. In the evenings, when the light faded and the soft click of wooden sandals echoed in the hall, she would sometimes sit by her writing table and compose letters to her family, but she did not send them. She wrote of the garden's changing colors, of the silence between words, of the way one could feel both distant and deeply present in the same moment. She wrote them like poems, soft, folded pieces of herself. And then, when the ink dried, she tucked them away. Not everything needed to reach its destination. Some things, she realized, were written simply to be known by the heart. The rhythm of grace. In time, the court stopped expecting her to rise quickly. They saw her as a constant, a woman who moved like the tide, slow and sure. That gave her space to observe, to learn, to breathe. She did not fear being forgotten, for she understood now that attention was only one kind of power. She had another, the power of patience, of rhythm, of grace. And so, as the seasons turned and the lanterns flickered in the corridors, she stood beneath the falling petals once more, not waiting, but simply being. And the court, ever so slowly, bent around her. Behind the screens, the architecture of seclusion. Before a word was ever spoken, the palace had already whispered its meaning. It whispered through sliding panels of paper and wood, through lacquered corridors that turned deliberately, through shadows that stretched across tatami floors like a second language. The world of the concubine was shaped not only by people, but by spaces, quiet, curated, and controlled. A world within a world. Imagine a vast complex of buildings connected by narrow, covered walkways. From the outside, the palace was unimposing, its wooden beams low to the ground, its gardens soft and untamed. But within, it was a maze of intent. Each hall, room, and courtyard had a purpose. Each threshold suggested hierarchy. No one walked in a straight line here. The paths were designed to curve, to slow the visitor, to create the sensation of entering a realm removed from the outside world. And that is exactly what it was. The women of the inner court lived in a world enclosed, not only by walls and custom, but by the very architecture that guided every breath. Fusuma and Byobu, the language of screens. Walls in the palace were rarely permanent. Instead, movable screens known as Fusuma and Byobu divided space with intention. Some were simple, painted with pine branches or misted mountains. Others shimmered with gold leaf, cranes in flight, or seasonal blossoms. These screens did more than decorate. They shielded, veiled, and suggested. A concubine rarely saw the entire figure of someone approaching. She might glimpse a silhouette, hear the rustle of a robe, smell the faint sweetness of incense trailing from a sleeve. Through these screens, presence was never complete, always partial, always suggested, and in that suggestion, power shifted. Rooms measured in mats. The rooms themselves were not measured by feet or meters, but by tatami mats. Each mat, a standard size, helped define not just space, but importance. A 6-mat room was humble. A 12-mat room, respectable. The emperor's private audience hall could span more than 40. Concubines often lived in rooms of 9 or 12 mats. Just enough space for writing, dressing, and reflection. But it was what they were allowed to bring into that space. Scrolls, incense burners, a musical instrument that quietly revealed their standing. No one said it aloud. They didn't need to. The room spoke for them. Listening to stillness. Sound traveled gently in the palace. Footsteps on polished floors. The creak of wood shifting in the morning breeze. The quiet slide of a door opening or closing. Women learned to listen, not just for voices, but for the pauses between them. Not for music, but for the breath just before the first note. This attentiveness became part of survival. A concubine who noticed too much was dangerous. One who noticed too little, forgettable. But one who listened quietly and chose when to speak, she could remain for years. The mystery of unseen eyes. Though many rooms were separated by thin paper and frame, privacy was a luxury. Attendants came and went. Messages were passed. Servants were stationed beyond each corridor. And yet, there was always the sense of being observed, not directly, but as though the palace itself remembered where one stood yesterday, what color one wore, who one walked beside on the garden path. This soft surveillance was not malicious. It was simply the nature of the space. A concubine lived not only with others, but with the walls themselves. They heard everything, and they never forgot. Objects of meaning, combs, mirrors, and the secret lives of belongings. In a palace where voices were soft and glances brief, it was the objects, quiet and unassuming, that often spoke the loudest. A comb left beside a window, a mirror wrapped in silk, a sachet of fragrance tucked into a drawer. Each one carried memory, intention, and meaning. And in the silent world of the concubine, they became companions more than possessions. The ivory comb. Her comb was carved from bone-white ivory, curved delicately like the rising moon. It had been given to her during her second year in the palace, not by the emperor, but by one of the senior attendants. "It suits quiet women," the attendant had said, almost smiling. Each morning, she passed it slowly through her hair, beginning at the crown and working downward in rhythmic strokes. Not hurried, not distracted. There was a calm ritual in the act. The comb did not just untangle, it centered. And each day she remembered who had handed it to her and why. The mirror beneath silk. In the back of a lacquered drawer, she kept her mirror wrapped in a square of indigo-dyed cloth. It was not especially polished. Its surface had darkened with age, reflecting the world in softened silver tones. But she preferred it that way. A perfect mirror might show every flaw. This one showed essence. She used it rarely, only before ceremonial events, or when composing poems about longing. Sometimes she would unwrap it simply to look, not at herself, but into it, as if the face staring back might belong to another woman, in another time, with another fate. Fragrance of memory. Each concubine had a scent, not chosen, but granted by the palace. Hers was plum blossom and cedar bark, subtle and clean. She kept a small sachet of this blend near her robes, and a second one under her pillow. It reminded her of winter, of her home province, of walking between trees before dawn. Some days, the scent would fade, and she would tuck new herbs into the sachet, pressing them down with careful fingers. The scent never declared her presence, but it lingered faintly when she left, and that, in the court, was enough. The writing box. Among her few permitted belongings was a calligraphy set, inkstone, brushes, and a box of thick, cream-colored paper. She wrote slowly, carefully, not for show. Her poems were simple but sincere. Often, she copied verses from old masters, letting the motion of brush against paper steady her thoughts. No one asked her to share them, but sometimes she left a folded poem beside a servant's tray, or placed one in the sleeve of a visitor she trusted. It was her way of speaking, without ever raising her voice, the quiet message of things. Objects in the palace were not merely tools. They were messengers. A comb left on a pillow could mean sorrow. A fan placed upside down might hint at disfavor. Even the way a robe was folded and left on a cushion, open or closed, tied or loose, carried meaning. She learned this language slowly, watching, remembering, adapting. In time, she could read a room not by its people, but by its objects. And so, while others chased words and alliances, she cultivated stillness through things, quiet, loyal things that never lied. The floating world within walls, music, poetry, and painted dreams. Though the outer world of the palace was rigid, its inner life often drifted like mist across water. Music, verse, and painted silk offered escape, not from duty, but from stillness that threatened to harden into silence. Within the confines of court life, the concubines built floating worlds, delicate and imagined, to rest inside when reality grew too heavy. Melodies in the morning light, in the hush of early morning, before the bells signaled the beginning of the day. She sometimes took out the kodo, the long, stringed instrument resting in a lacquered box beneath her screen. She did not play for others. She played for the quiet itself. Her fingers moved with slow confidence, coaxing long, melancholy tones from the strings. Each note lingered, then disappeared like breath on glass. She did not know if the emperor ever heard. That was never the point. The music shaped the space around her. It softened the stone edges of the day. A court of poets. Poetry was the true language of the palace. It hung in the air like incense, exchanged not just for beauty, but to express what could not be said directly. A concubine might compose a short verse to respond to a gesture, to reflect a mood, or to hint at longing. During court poetry gatherings, each woman sat with brush in hand, waiting for the chosen theme. Evening mist, forgotten footsteps, the cry of unseen cranes. She learned to write with layered meaning, a sadness beneath grace, a hope hidden in metaphor. Sometimes the emperor would read aloud the verses afterward. Sometimes he would pause, and once, she believed, he paused because of hers. Painted dreams and folding screens. Byobu screens, tall, hinged panels that stood in rooms like silent witnesses, were more than decoration. They captured moments, imagined or real, and turned them into. She had one in her quarters, gifted after her second winter at court. It showed a village nestled among autumn hills, with foxes darting between the trees and smoke curling from tiny rooftops. She often stared at it for long stretches, imagining she lived inside that painted world, not as a woman of status, but as a figure with no name, just someone walking beside a stream, listening to leaves fall. Calligraphy as breath. Calligraphy was not taught for elegance alone. It was a mirror of the soul. The way a brush curved, bold or hesitant, revealed more than one's robes ever could. She practiced each stroke in silence. When she was sad, the ink grew heavier. When she felt distant, the lines became airy, uncertain. Over time, she began keeping a quiet collection. Small slips of paper, folded once and tied with a string, stored in a lacquered box. No one would ever read them, but she knew what each one meant. And that was enough. The unseen curtain. Behind all this beauty, music, poetry, painting, was something else. A veil, not literal, but emotional. The more she created, the more she realized how much of her inner life remained unshared, unspoken. The court admired verse. It welcomed performance, but rarely did it ask how she truly felt when she wrote. And so she gave them beauty, carefully shaped, gently wrapped, while keeping the ache of longing tucked beneath her sleeves. She existed in the floating world, but she never forgot she was only visiting threads of the past, Heian echoes and ancient courtly traditions. In the stillness of the palace, the past was never far. It drifted like incense through every room, clung to the folds of every robe, and whispered from the brushstrokes of ancient poems. The concubines did not simply live in the present. They lived in the shadow of a court that had existed for centuries. Each gesture, each ritual, each word carried echoes of Heian elegance, long preserved and never questioned. A legacy written in layers. By the time she entered the palace, the Heian era had long passed, centuries ago, when Kyoto was still young and the imperial court lived almost entirely in verse and perfume, but its influence remained. Every sleeve she wore, every poem she wrote, every path she walked, had once been shaped by that golden age. And within the palace walls, it was as though the clock had never fully moved forward. Even her name, chosen for its poetry and seasonal beauty, echoed those older times. She was not just a woman. She was part of a lineage. Robes that remembered. The robes of the court were not simply garments. They were timekeepers. Each season brought its own palette, its own arrangement of layers, some combinations centuries old, with names that recalled nature and memory. Plum blossom and first frost, early willow over morning mist, wisteria trailing through pale rain. She learned how to fold them, how to drape them, how to let the sleeves trail just far enough to be graceful but not indulgent. And as she dressed each morning, she became aware she was part of a performance older than anyone living. Even her quiet footsteps echoed steps taken 1,000 years before. Writing in the old hand, calligraphy in the palace was not taught for utility. It was reverence. She practiced the flowing kana script, developed by Heian court women, and still considered the most graceful form of expression. Each character curved like a branch in wind. Each line was meant to reflect the inner self. The ink, the paper, the brush, they were sacred tools. And when she wrote, she often imagined those women of long ago, writing under lantern light, waiting by screens, watching their own place in history dissolve into verse. She did not feel modern. She felt eternal. The rituals that endured. Seasonal rituals still guided life in the palace. In spring, cherry blossoms were gathered and floated in sake. In autumn, moon viewing platforms were prepared with fragrant rice cakes and poems on white paper. These were not events for the outside world. They were inward-facing, quiet acknowledgments of time's passing. Even on days of sorrow, incense was lit, with particular woods, each chosen for its ancient meaning. The concubines bowed not just to the emperor, but to a way of life that had endured, unbroken. Tradition here was not nostalgic. It was present, living, breathing, a palace of echoes. She often wondered, was she truly herself? Or simply another thread in the long weaving of imperial court life? She lived in rooms where others had lived, wrote poems others had written, loved, or tried to love as others had done before. And yet, in those repetitions, there was comfort. She did not have to create something new. She only had to carry the thread forward, to hold it gently, as others had, and pass it on when the time came. That, in itself, was enough. Sacred boundaries, religion, superstition, and the invisible world. Not all walls in the palace were made of wood and silk. Some were unseen, drawn in salt, in breath, in prayer. The women of the court moved within a world where spirits stirred behind folding screens, where illness was a shadow with intention, and where the divine lived quietly in corners. The concubine's life was shaped not only by human politics, but by reverence for forces no eye could meet. The shrine in the garden, tucked near a grove of bamboo, just beyond the eastern walkway, was a small Shinto shrine, its wooden eaves faded, its roof soft with moss. It was not grand, it was not spoken of often, but each morning a servant left an offering: rice, a sliver of dried fish, a spray of fresh plum blossom. The concubines passed it in silence. Some bowed, some simply glanced. She often paused there, not to ask for favor, but to listen, to the rustle of leaves, to the chirr of insects, to something older than the court, older even than the emperor, something that watched but did not judge. Salt at the threshold. In certain seasons, especially during illness or birth, the attendants placed small bowls of salt at the thresholds of the women's rooms. It was said to purify, to guard against unseen things that moved through air and silence. No one explained the practice. It had simply always been done. She grew to find comfort in it. These pale crystals glowing faintly in the shadows, to something older than the court, older even than the emperor, something that watched but did not judge. Salt at the threshold. In certain seasons, especially during illness or birth, the attendants placed small bowls of salt at the thresholds of the women's rooms. It was said to purify, to guard against unseen things that moved through air and silence. No one explained the practice. It had simply always been done. She grew to find comfort in it, these pale crystals glowing faintly in the shadows. They reminded her that not all protection was loud, that sometimes safety was a quiet arrangement, an invisible boundary between what was known and what must be kept away. the fox, and the wind. There were stories, always whispered, never written. A servant had once glimpsed a fox near the garden lanterns, and later fell ill. Another had stepped across a shadow she should not have, and lost her voice for days. The women of the court did not mock such things. They wore small amulets sewn into their sleeves. They avoided mirrors at night. They folded their robes with care, so the soul would not wander in dreams. She herself had never seen a spirit, but she had felt something once, a sudden stillness in the corridor, a chill though the air was warm, a sense of being gently observed. She did not run. She bowed her head and kept walking. The influence of the moon. The moon guided much of court life. It marked poetry contests, love letters, rituals of purification. She often stood at the edge of her veranda when it rose, watching it catch on the lacquered tiles, soften the hard lines of the palace into silver shadow. Some said it carried messages. Others claimed it drew out emotion. She believed only that it made things quieter. Beneath the moon, her thoughts slowed, and in that stillness, she sometimes understood things that Gay would not reveal. Reverence in every gesture. Even in the simplest acts, pouring tea, arranging flowers, lighting incense, there was reverence. Each gesture was a kind of offering, a quiet alignment with balance, with beauty, with that which could not be explained. The palace was not just a home for politics or desire. It was a sacred space, delicately perched between the world of men and the realm of spirits. To live there was to learn humility, to know that not all power was seen. Not all voices were heard aloud. And in that knowing, she found peace. The hierarchies within, rank, favor, and invisible lines. In the gentle rhythm of palace life, hierarchy was not always shouted. It was whispered, hinted, folded into robes, and reflected in seating arrangements. Every concubine knew her place, not by what was spoken aloud, but by what was left unsaid. Rank shaped everything, where one walked, how one ate, and which screen she waited behind. There were no locked doors in the inner palace, only layers of protocol. A concubine of the fourth rank could not cross into the quarters of one above her without formal summons. Even glances had their own subtle hierarchies. Who could meet whose eyes, and for how long? Meals were served in order of status. The higher the rank, the warmer the rice, the fresher the fruit. No one complained. That too was a form of silence. A favored woman might receive silks of brighter color, or be granted a private veranda overlooking the garden. Another might wait months for such recognition, only to be passed by. But rank could shift like the wind. One season of favor could elevate. One mistake could erase years of quiet waiting. Still, within these delicate rules, women found ways to survive. Some did so by remaining invisible. Others learned the art of gentle assertion, stepping forward just enough to be noticed, never enough to appear presumptuous. The true currency of the palace was not beauty or youth. It was timing. The attendants' world, servants, messengers, and silent witnesses. The concubine was never truly alone. Behind her quiet, there were always footsteps, soft, deliberate, belonging to those who waited just beyond the screen. They were the hands that folded her robes, the eyes that watched but never asked, the ears that heard what no one admitted to saying. Each concubine had a small group of attendants, loyal, discreet, and trained in the quiet arts of observation. Some had served since childhood. Others had been brought from noble households to learn courtly discipline. They spoke little and moved even less. An attendant could enter a room without stirring the lamp's flame. She could understand her mistress's mood by the angle of a comb or the absence of perfume. These women held knowledge like water cupped in their hands, careful not to spill, careful not to grasp too tightly. When letters needed to be sent discreetly, they carried them. When tempers flared behind brocade screens, they remained calm, offering cool cloths and warm tea without judgment. They saw the rise and fall of favorites. They remembered every expression on the emperor's face. Yet they left no record. Their loyalty was silent but constant. Sometimes a concubine trusted them more than her peers. Sometimes they were the only ones who knew when she wept. The emperor's glance, power, distance, and fleeting intimacy. He was not always present. In truth, most days passed without a glimpse of his robes, and yet his absence was felt as clearly as his nearness. The emperor was not just a man. He was a presence, a symbol, a wish that could rise or vanish with the turning of a season. A concubine did not seek the emperor. She waited to be summoned. Sometimes it was a formal invitation, written in elegant script and delivered by a court official. Other times it came in the form of a folded fan or a scented cloth left on her tray. Subtle signals known only to those within the palace's long traditions. An evening with the emperor did not guarantee favor. Many were summoned once, never to be called again. Others, rarely seen in public, became quiet powers within the court. When he did arrive, the air changed. His steps were measured, his words few, and yet everything mattered. The direction of his glance, the weight of his silence, the choice of poem shared over plum wine. For some, he was distant and divine. For others, he was simply a man shaped by ritual, bound by duty. To be close to him was to live in a place both privileged and precarious. And yet, most concubines did not love him. They revered the idea of him, not the person. Celebrations and ceremonies, life inside the calendar. The year passed not in months, but in moments. Ceremonies stitched the seasons together. Soft spring rituals with blossom-filled sake. Solemn autumn nights beneath the moon. Even within the silence of the palace, there were days of laughter, of lantern light, of careful joy. The new year was the most elaborate. Robes of bright red and white were laid out the night before. Attendants braided new cords. Sweet rice cakes were prepared in silent kitchens, wrapped in leaves and tied with golden string. On the day itself, the emperor greeted his court. Concubines waited in order of rank, offering shallow bows, their faces calm, even as their hearts quickened with hope. Other festivals followed, the doll festival in spring, where figurines representing emperors and empresses were arranged in tiers and left beside trays of sweet sake and tiny shrimp. In summer came the star festival, Tanabata, when women wrote poems on strips of paper and hung them from bamboo, hoping the celestial lovers would meet above them. There were also quiet days of prayer for the dead, when incense curled upward from small altars, and the halls smelled of sandalwood and memory. Ceremony gave structure to palace life. Without it, the days would blur. With it, even sorrow had a place to rest. Outsiders and shadows, the world beyond the gates. She rarely thought of the world beyond the outer walls. Not because it wasn't real, but because it had become quiet within her. Distant, softened. A place she had once known, now pressed flat like a pressed blossom. between the pages of a book. Letters came only occasionally. Her family, though noble, had learned not to ask questions. To serve in the court was both honor and silence. She thought sometimes of the streets, of the sound of sandals on stone, of the fish sellers calling at dawn, of the wet smell of riverbanks in spring. But such thoughts were not useful. The outer world was unpredictable, loud, full of hunger and heat. Here, in the palace, everything had shape and form. Even sorrow was folded neatly away. Visitors from the outside arrived rarely, and when they did, they carried the smell of wind and ash. Foreign, unsettling. She would watch them from behind the screen, marveling at their ease, their voices. And then when they left, she would return to her ink and her poem. The outside world no longer needed her. She belonged to the stillness now. Fading lanterns, when beauty becomes memory. Nothing in the court was permanent. Not the seasons, not favor, not even beauty. The life of a concubine was always suspended, like a lantern in the evening, glowing just long enough to be noticed, before the oil ran low. She knew this from the moment she entered, and yet when the glow began to dim, it surprised her still. She first noticed it in the way others passed her in the corridor. Once they had bowed, even if only slightly. Once her sleeves had rustled with purpose. Now there was a softness to their steps, a gentleness that did not speak reverence, but something closer to farewell. She was not old, but in the court, youth faded not with age but with presence. There were newer faces now, younger women with delicate gestures, poems still hesitant on their tongues. They reminded her of herself, though she could never say so aloud. She did not resent them. Instead, she watched quietly, remembering the whisper of silk. Her silks were still fine, still dyed with seasonal precision, still scented faintly with plum blossom and ash, but no longer new. Attendants handled them more carefully now, not from reverence, but from age. The dye at the edges of one robe had begun to pale, and the embroidery on another had worn smooth from repeated folding. No one remarked on it, but she noticed. And in the quiet of her quarters, she began taking longer with her dress, not out of vanity, but out of ritual. She wanted to remember how it felt, to wrap herself in color, to become part of the moment, even as it passed. Visitors who did not come. There were evenings she waited, not because of a summons, but from habit. She sat with her poetry box nearby, her hair brushed and bound in the style the emperor once favored. A tray of tea, still warm, beside her. Incense lit, but no messenger arrived. And slowly the tea cooled. The incense thinned, and the door remained untouched. There was no shame in being passed over. No anger either. Only the ache of stillness, a slow turning inward. The poems that changed. She still wrote, perhaps more than ever before. But her poems no longer sought approval. They no longer mirrored the styles of favored courtiers, or borrowed metaphors from imperial verse. Instead, she wrote what she felt. She wrote of rivers not seen in years, of leaves falling on rooftops far beyond the capital, of faces once loved, long gone. She folded them herself, placed them in lacquered drawers, tied with threads of blue or white. No one asked for these. Sometimes, late at night, She reread them by lamplight. She did not cry, but she did not smile either. What remained? She was still a concubine. Her title had not changed. Her room was still hers. Attendants still came, though fewer now. She still rose at the same hour, still bowed in ceremony, still walked the garden path when the season allowed. But something had quieted in her. Not grief, not disappointment, acceptance. She had lived the life offered to her, worn its silks, written its poems, felt its loneliness and its wonder. Now she stood near its edge, not banished, not discarded, simply fading like a lantern, held aloft long enough to give light, now ready to rest. Fading lanterns when beauty becomes memory. The halls of the palace grew quieter, though nothing had truly changed. The footsteps of courtiers remained soft, the rustle of silk the same, but she noticed subtle things, fewer greetings, more glances slipping past her without pause. She was still young by most measures, but the palace did not measure age in years. It counted seasons of favor, the emperor's attention, and the color of one's sleeves. Her robes were still beautiful, but they were not new. The embroidery along the cuffs had frayed from countless ceremonies and nights spent waiting. She no longer received folded notes or requests for poetry. The emperor's messengers had not visited in many weeks, perhaps longer. She kept her appearance, still rising early, still attending courtly functions with quiet grace. But she had begun to understand what it meant to fade. She was not bitter. There was something gentle in this retreat from visibility. She found herself watching the younger women with soft eyes, remembering when she too had entered with hope fluttering beneath her layers of silk. Now, her time in the light waned, like the last glow of a lantern after dusk. Letters never sent, memories of a family long left behind. There were drawers filled with letters she never sent. Some were addressed to her mother, others to sisters whose faces had grown distant in her memory. A few bore no name, only fragments of thought, verses of longing scribbled on rice paper and folded in silence. She had written often in the first years, of palace life, of the colors of the seasons, of things she hoped they might understand. But the letters were never sent. The rules were unspoken but clear. What happened behind the palace walls belonged only to the emperor and his court. Time blurred the ties that had once bound her to the outside world. When she dreamed, it was not of home, but of her youth, moments before her arrival, scents and songs now half remembered. Still, on quiet mornings, she read her old drafts aloud to herself. It was a ritual, a way of keeping those lost connections alive, if only in whispers. She did not expect replies. She did not even expect to leave. But within those unsent letters lived her truest voice, one shaped not by court ceremony, but by who she once was. The garden at dusk, a place for forgotten things. She often walked the outer edge of the garden near dusk, when the air turned cool and the world seemed held in a single breath. It was the one place in the palace where memory felt close, where silence spoke. The garden paths were familiar, the worn stones beneath her feet, the faint creak of bamboo fences, the faint splash of koi in the shallow pond. Here she was not watched. No one waited to record her presence. She could move slowly, allowing thought to rise and drift like mist above water. This was where she brought her unfinished poems, fragments she had written during long nights or sudden bursts of thought. She would sit near the edge of the stream and whisper them into the air, as though releasing them to the wind. No one had ever seen her cry there, but she had once or twice, when memory rose too quickly, or when the garden's beauty reminded her of what could not last. In the fading light, she felt most herself, and most forgotten. The quiet between ceremonies, days without purpose. There were days with no duties, no rituals, no poetry gatherings, no summons. The palace was never idle, yet for some, those beyond the emperor's gaze, time stretched without shape. These were the days she feared most, not for what they held, but for what they didn't. She would sit for hours with her inkstone, brush poised but unmoving, or arrange hairpins, only to place them back untouched. Her attendants, ever discreet, said nothing. They understood these silences. Sometimes she reread old notes. Sometimes she traced the grain of her screen with one finger, lost in thought. She remembered how her heart had once leapt at the sound of footsteps outside her door. Now she hoped they passed by. Still, there was calm to be found. In the absence of duty, she could reflect. These were the quiet spaces between performances, when the mask slipped slightly, and she was neither concubine nor courtier, but something else, something closer to a person. And in that, there was peace. When the curtains fall, legacy without a name, her name would not appear in the official records. Only the favored few were immortalized in scrolls or tales. Most concubines faded into the background, their stories left behind like dried petals pressed between forgotten books. She knew this, and she accepted it. Legacy, in the court, was not a matter of deeds alone. It was who remembered you, and for how long. She did not seek fame, or even memory, but in her poems, her careful letters, her practiced rituals, she had left a thread of herself. Perhaps one day, a servant would find a forgotten verse, or a young woman might wear a comb she once favored. Perhaps no one would ever know her name, but she had lived. She had once laughed in spring light. She had once stood beneath the emperor's gaze. She had once cried into her sleeves when the world grew too quiet. Now she closed her eyes in stillness, not with regret, but with the calm of one who has seen the moon rise and set and rise again. And that was enough. And so the silken corridors of the imperial palace grow quiet once more. The clink of jade ornaments has stilled. The lamps have burned low, and the footsteps of the concubines fade into silence, like dreams returning to the shadows of memory. Through gardens and poems, ceremonies and seasons, we have wandered gently through the hidden world behind the screens. A world that rarely spoke above a whisper, yet echoed with longing, patience, and grace. The lives of these women, though seldom etched into history's stone, were not empty. They were lives of waiting, of watching, of shaping beauty in small, deliberate ways, of being present in a world that often forgot their names. Still they endured. Still they dreamed. Let this quiet journey rest softly in your thoughts, like the fold of a fan or the hush of falling plum blossoms. The past is never gone. It simply sleeps. Thank you for joining me, as always, in this gentle retelling. If you're still awake, I wonder, what time is it where you are now? Feel free to leave a comment and let us know. And if sleep has taken you by now, then may your dreams be filled with lantern light, inked verses, and a hush of silk in a moonlit hall. Until next time, Historian Couch signs off.